They tried to break her with chains, with labor, with punishment. And when that failed, they sold her. Again and again and again. 12 times they passed her from one owner to another, each one convinced they would succeed where the last had failed. But Hagar Ashford was not just strong. She was thinking, watching, learning. And the more they tried to control her, the more dangerous she became. Welcome to Untold Enslaved. If you are new to this channel, take a moment to subscribe and like our videos so you never miss the hidden stories that shape the past. We truly appreciate every single one of you who watches and supports this journey into the forgotten corners of history. Tonight's story is one you will not want to miss even a single paragraph of. Stay with us until the very end, because this is not just a story of survival. It is a story of a mind that refused to bow, a woman who turned intelligence into resistance, and a system that could not contain her. So relax, settle in, and let us begin. The auction yard in the year 1860 was never quiet, but that day carried a different kind of noise. Not louder, not chaotic, but tense. The kind of tension that moves beneath conversation, beneath movement, beneath the surface of what appears normal. Buyers stood in small clusters, their voices low but sharp, discussing value, strength, endurance, as if human life could be reduced to measurements and numbers written into a ledger. The enslaved stood in lines, their bodies still, their futures uncertain, their identities already being rewritten before the sale was even complete. It was a place where names were spoken only long enough to be replaced, where memory was treated as something that could be erased with enough distance. Then she stepped forward. Hagar Ashford. She did not look like the others, not because she was untouched by what surrounded her, but because she refused to let it define how she stood within it. She was taller than most, her presence unmistakable, even before her name was called. Her shoulders were straight, not in defiance, but in something deeper. Control, awareness. Her eyes did not move the way others did, searching for safety, avoiding attention. They observed, measured, understood, and that alone made people uncomfortable. The auctioneer noticed it immediately. He had seen thousands pass through that yard, had learned to read posture, fear, compliance. He knew how to speak about them, how to present them in ways that increased value, how to hide what needed to be hidden and exaggerate what needed to be sold. But Hagar did not fit into the language he was used to using. There was no easy way to describe her. Strength, yes. Health, yes. But there was something else, something he could not name in a way that would not raise concern. Still, he began. Strong woman, he called out, his voice carrying across the yard, built for labor, capable, experienced. A man stepped forward, studying her closely, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in her posture, her stillness, the way she did not shift under attention. Does she follow orders? He asked. The question hung in the air longer than it should have. The auctioneer hesitated just for a second, then answered. She works. It was not the answer the man had asked for, and everyone knew it. Hagar spoke, not loudly, not with force, but with clarity. I understand orders. The yard went still. A few heads turned. A few men shifted their stance, but she was not finished. I just choose which ones deserve to be followed. Silence settled heavily across the space, the kind that does not come from confusion, but from disruption. The man's expression changed immediately, his interest sharpening, not fading. She will be difficult, he said. The auctioneer forced a small laugh, trying to regain control of the moment. All of them are at first, he replied. But Hagar did not look away, did not lower her gaze, did not correct herself because she had not misspoken. She had stated something she believed, and belief like that was dangerous. The bidding began higher than expected, not because she was easy, but because she was a challenge, and men like that did not walk away from challenges. They tried to conquer them. She was sold for a price that reflected not just her strength, but the risk no one fully understood yet. The first plantation believed in discipline, not just in punishment, but in structure, in routine, in control that extended into every part of a person's life until there was nothing left untouched by it. From the moment Hagar arrived, that system began to test her. Not because she challenged it openly, but because she did not respond to it the way others did. She worked. That was never the issue. Her hands moved with strength and precision, her body capable of enduring the physical demands placed upon it. But work alone was not enough. Obedience was required. Submission was expected. And that was where the problem began. She followed instructions when they made sense. When they did not, she did not. The overseer noticed quickly. He had dealt with resistance before, loud defiance, anger, refusal. Those things could be met directly, punished, broken down over time. But Hagar was different. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue without reason. She did not create disruption for the sake of it. She simply chose, and that choice unsettled him. "You will do as you are told," he said one afternoon, his voice firm, his posture meant to reinforce the structure he represented. Hagar looked at him, not slowly, not hesitantly, directly. "I will do what is right," she replied. The air between them tightened. "You do not decide what is right," he said. She did not move. "That is where you are wrong." There was no anger in her voice, no challenge, just certainty, and certainty is harder to break than defiance. The punishment came, it always did, but it did not produce the expected result. Hagar endured it, not with silence meant to hide weakness, but with silence that revealed strength, the kind that does not change under pressure, the kind that does not shift to survive, but remains. Within weeks, the decision was made. She was not worth the effort. Too difficult, too independent, too aware. She was sold again. The second plantation believed in control through calculation, less force, more manipulation. The master there saw something different in Hagar, not just a problem, but an opportunity. He spoke to her directly. "You are intelligent," he said. She said nothing. "That can be useful," he continued. She met his gaze. "Or dangerous." He smiled slightly. "That depends on you." She shook her head. "No, it depends on you." The conversation ended there, but the balance had already been established. He tried to use her intelligence, to guide others, to create order, but intelligence that is aware cannot be redirected easily. Hagar did not become what he expected. She did not influence others in the way he wanted. She influenced them differently, quietly by example, by presence, by refusing to disappear into obedience. Others began to watch her, not openly, but carefully. They saw how she moved, how she chose, how she remained herself in a place designed to erase identity. And something began to shift. Small at first, but real. The master saw it and understood. This was not control. This was influence, and it did not belong to him. She was sold again. By the time she was sold the fourth time, her name had begun to carry weight. Not widely, not openly, but enough. Hagar Ashford, the woman who could not be controlled, the one who worked but did not submit, the one who listened but did not obey blindly. Some refused to buy her at all. Others sought her out to test themselves, to prove something, to win. But this was not something that could be won, because Hagar was not fighting them. She was refusing to become what they expected, and that is something no system is built to handle. By the time she was sold the 12th time, she had become more than a person being traded. She had become a question, one no one could answer. What happens when a human being refuses to surrender their mind? By the time Hagar Ashford arrived at the 5th plantation, she was no longer seen as just another purchase. Her name had begun to move ahead of her, carried quietly from one place to another. Not as open warning, but as cautious conversation. Men spoke of her in measured tones, careful not to reveal uncertainty, but unable to hide it completely. She was strong, yes. Capable, yes. But that was not what made her different. It was her mind, the way she observed before acting, the way she listened without appearing to submit, the way she made decisions in silence. And silence, when it comes from awareness rather than fear, is something that unsettles even those who believe they hold power. The man who bought her this time believed himself different. He was not the type to rely only on force. He believed in control through structure, through making people depend on the system rather than fight against it. When Hagar arrived, he did not rush to test her. He watched. Days passed before he spoke to her directly, observing how she worked, how she moved, how others responded to her presence. What he saw confirmed what he had heard. She worked well, efficiently, without hesitation when the task made sense. But there were moments, small but clear, when she chose differently, when she adjusted a process, when she ignored an unnecessary command, when she acted in a way that was not expected but still effective. He approached her one evening, his tone calm, his posture controlled. "You do not like to be told what to do," he said. Hagar looked at him, not challenging, not avoiding, simply present. "I listen," she replied. He studied her. "That is not the same thing." She did not disagree. "No," she said. "It is not." There was no confrontation in the exchange, no raised voices. But something passed between them that made the difference clear. He was used to shaping behavior. She was used to deciding her own. And those two things do not exist easily in the same space. At first, he allowed it. He believed he could guide her, slowly bring her into alignment with what he needed. But influence does not always move in the direction expected. The others began to notice her more closely, not because she spoke to them directly, but because of how she carried herself. She did not rush. She did not react out of fear. She moved with intention, and intention, when observed repeatedly, becomes something others begin to understand. One afternoon, a younger man hesitated before following an order that made little sense. It was a small moment, easy to overlook, but it happened, and it did not happen before Hagar arrived. The master noticed, and that was enough. Within weeks, the pattern became clear. Not loud, not organized, but present. People were thinking more, pausing more, choosing more carefully. It was not rebellion, not in the way it could be easily punished. It was something quieter, something harder to reach, and it was spreading. Hagar was sold again. The sixth plantation did not believe in patience. They believed in force. The moment Hagar arrived, the tone was different. There was no observation period, no attempt to understand, only immediate expectation, immediate control, immediate pressure to conform. The overseer made that clear from the first day, his voice loud, his movement sharp, his authority expressed through intensity rather than calculation. "You will follow every order," he said. Hagar listened, as she always did. But listening is not the same as submission. The work began. Harder, more demanding, less structured. Designed not just to produce labor, but to break resistance. Hagar worked. She always worked. But she did not break. Days passed. Then weeks. The overseer grew frustrated. He was used to visible results, to change, to signs that pressure was working. But Hagar did not show those signs. She did not collapse into obedience. She did not react in ways that gave him control. She remained steady, unchanged in the ways that mattered. So he pushed harder. More pressure, more punishment, more attempts to force a reaction. But reaction is not the same as change. And Hagar understood that. One evening, after a long day of work, he approached her again, his patience gone, his frustration clear. "You think you are stronger than this place," he said. Hagar looked at him, not with anger, not with defiance, with clarity. "No," she said. "I think differently than this place." The distinction mattered, but he did not understand it. And because he did not understand it, he could not control it. The decision was made quickly. She was not worth the effort. She was sold again. By the seventh and eighth sales, something had become undeniable. It was not just that Hagar could not be controlled. It was that she changed the space around her. Not loudly, not through direct influence, but through presence. People began to think more when she was near, to question quietly, to hesitate before acting without reason, to recognize that obedience without thought was not the only way to exist. And that recognition was dangerous. The system depended on predictability, on repetition, on the absence of independent thought. Hagar disrupted that without ever raising her voice, without ever organizing, without ever declaring anything. She simply existed as someone who refused to surrender her mind. And that was enough. By the 9th, 10th, and 11th sales, her reputation had grown beyond individual plantations. Traders spoke of her carefully. Buyers approached with caution. Some refused outright. Others bought her out of pride. To prove they could succeed where others had failed. They all failed. Not because she resisted loudly, but because she remained consistent. And consistency, when it does not align with control, becomes something that cannot be shaped. By the time she was sold the 12th time, the system had begun to recognize something it could not fix. Hagar Ashford was not broken. She was not rebellious in the way they understood. She was not defiant for the sake of resistance. She was something else entirely. A mind that could not be owned. And that was something they had no answer for. By the time Hagar Ashford reached the 12th plantation, she was no longer seen as an investment. She was a question no one wanted to answer, but everyone felt forced to confront. Her reputation had moved faster than she had, carried through traders, whispered between buyers, passed along with a tone that was never fully confident. Strong, they said. Capable, they admitted. But difficult. Not in the way that could be corrected. Not in the way that could be punished into submission. Difficult in a way that made control uncertain. The man who purchased her did not pretend otherwise. He had heard the stories. All of them. And unlike the others, he did not buy her to prove something. He bought her because he wanted to understand something. And that difference, though subtle, changed everything from the moment she arrived. The plantation itself was different from the others. Not softer, not kinder, but quieter. The kind of quiet that comes from long-standing order rather than constant enforcement. The workers moved with routine, not urgency. The overseers spoke less, watched more. It was a place where control existed not just through force, but through structure so deeply embedded that it no longer needed to announce itself. When Hagar stepped onto that land, she noticed it immediately. Not the buildings, not the fields, the pattern, the rhythm, the way everything functioned without disruption. And for the first time since her first sale, she paused. Not physically, but mentally, because this place was not built to break resistance. It was built to absorb it. The master did not meet her right away. He watched first. Days passed as he observed her from a distance, noting how she worked, how she moved, how she interacted without ever appearing to engage directly. She did what was required. No more, no less. She did not test boundaries. She did not push against orders unnecessarily. But she did not disappear into them either. She remained present, aware, separate in a way that could not be easily explained but was impossible to ignore. Others noticed it too, not because she told them anything, but because she did not carry the same tension. And tension, when absent in a place built on it, becomes visible. When he finally approached her, it was without announcement. No audience, no display of authority. Just a man walking towards someone he had decided to understand rather than control. "You have been sold many times," he said. Hagar looked at him. "Yes." He nodded slightly. "That usually means something is wrong." She did not respond immediately. Then she spoke. "It means something does not fit." The answer settled between them. Not confrontational, not defensive, just clear. He studied her for a moment longer. "And what is it that does not fit?" he asked. She met his gaze without hesitation. "Your system expects obedience without thought. I do not function that way." The difference between this plantation and the others became clearer over time. There was no immediate attempt to force her into compliance beyond what was necessary. No escalation of punishment. No effort to break her in the ways others had tried. Instead, there was observation, adjustment, a quiet attempt to understand what could not be easily controlled. The master changed small things around her, not to accommodate her, but to see how she responded. Tasks shifted, expectations adjusted slightly. Not enough to disrupt the structure, but enough to test whether her resistance was rooted in defiance or in something deeper. Hagar responded the same way she always had. She worked when the work made sense. She followed instructions when they aligned with purpose. She ignored what did not. But here something different happened. Instead of immediate punishment, there was pause, a moment where the system itself seemed to hesitate, unsure of how to respond to something that did not follow its rules, but did not fully oppose them either. That hesitation created space. Small at first, almost invisible, but real. And in that space, others began to notice something they had not seen before. Not rebellion, not freedom, but the possibility of thought existing without immediate consequence. One man hesitated before completing a task that had always been done without question. Another adjusted his approach, choosing efficiency over blind repetition. These were not acts of defiance. They were acts of awareness. And awareness spreads quietly. It does not need instruction. It does not require permission. It only needs to be seen once to exist again. The overseers noticed. Of course they did. But their response was slower, less certain, because the changes were not disruptive enough to punish directly, and yet they were changing something fundamental. The master saw it clearly. What he had purchased was not just a person who could not be controlled. It was a presence that altered how others thought without ever speaking to them. And that was something far more dangerous than open resistance. Open resistance can be crushed. Quiet awareness cannot be easily reached. He stood one evening watching the field, his gaze fixed not on Hagar alone, but on the subtle shifts happening around her. "You are changing them," he said when he finally approached her again. Hagar did not look surprised. "No," she replied, "they are changing themselves." The system began to strain, not loudly but internally, the kind of strain that does not break structures immediately, but weakens them over time. The overseers grew more watchful, their movements tighter, their voices sharper when addressing groups rather than individuals. They sensed something was shifting, but could not isolate it. There was no clear source, no single act of rebellion, no direct cause, only a pattern that no longer followed the lines they were used to enforcing. Hagar remained at the center of it without ever placing herself there. She did not gather people. She did not speak in groups. She did not attempt to organize anything. And yet everything seemed to move differently around her. People began to look at situations before reacting, to consider before obeying, to understand before repeating. It was not enough to dismantle the system, not yet, but it was enough to make it unstable. And instability, once introduced, does not disappear. The master found himself facing something he had not expected. Not resistance, not defiance, but limitation. The realization that control, even when carefully constructed, has boundaries. And those boundaries become visible when something exists outside of them without directly opposing them. He approached Hagar one final time with a question that carried more weight than any command he had given before. "If you cannot be controlled," he said, "then what are you?" Hagar looked at him, her expression unchanged. "A person who thinks," she answered. The simplicity of it unsettled him more than anything else had, because it revealed something he could not argue against. The plantation did not collapse in a single moment. It did not erupt into chaos or fall apart visibly. It changed slowly, the way all systems change when something fundamental within them is no longer stable. The structure remained. The routines continued, but the certainty that had once defined it began to fade. And without certainty, control becomes effort, and effort over time weakens. Hagar was not sold again, not because she had been fixed, but because she could no longer be placed elsewhere without carrying the same effect. She had become something the system could not relocate. Not a problem to solve, but a reality to face. The master stopped trying to understand how to control her. Instead, he began to understand what she represented. Not rebellion, not disobedience, but awareness. The one thing the system was never built to handle. And once awareness exists, it cannot be removed. It can only spread slowly, quietly, until it reaches a point where the structure around it must either change or break. Hagar Ashford remained, not as someone who fought the system directly, but as someone who exposed its limits simply by existing. And sometimes, that is the most powerful resistance of all. The change did not stay contained within the boundaries of that plantation. Systems like that depend on isolation to survive, on the belief that each place exists on its own, untouched by what happens elsewhere. But Hagar Ashford had already proven something they could not undo. She had moved through 12 different plantations, 12 different systems of control, 12 different attempts to shape her into something obedient. And each time she had left behind something they could not erase. Not rebellion, not destruction, but awareness. And awareness travels, even when people do not. Traders carried it first, though they did not realize what they were spreading. Conversations between sales, quiet remarks exchanged between buyers, observations passed along in ways that seemed casual but were not. There is a woman, they said, strong, intelligent, not easy to manage. But those words did not capture the truth. What they were really describing was something they did not understand. A person who did not respond the way the system required. And every time that description was repeated, it planted something. A question, a doubt, a possibility that control was not as complete as it appeared. On nearby plantations, small changes began to appear. Not connected in any obvious way. Not organized, but present. A worker pausing before following an unnecessary command. Another choosing a more efficient method instead of repeating what had always been done. A quiet refusal that did not escalate into punishment because it was not obvious enough to justify it. These were not acts of open resistance. They were acts of thought. And thought, once it begins, does not need permission to continue. The owners began to notice patterns they could not explain. Productivity did not collapse. Work still happened. But something had shifted. The certainty of obedience was no longer absolute. There were moments of hesitation, moments of choice, moments where the system did not operate as smoothly as it once had. And those moments created tension, not enough to cause immediate reaction, but enough to create unease, enough to force attention. Back on the plantation where Hagar remained, the master could feel that shift extending beyond his land. He heard it in the way traders spoke, in the way neighboring owners began asking different questions. Not about strength, not about endurance, but about behavior, about thought, about control. And for the first time, he understood something clearly. This was no longer about one person. This was about what one person had revealed. Chapter 5. Hagar did not move differently. She did not change her behavior to match the growing impact around her. She continued as she always had, working when necessary, observing always, choosing deliberately. But the effect of her presence had reached a point where it no longer depended on her direct interaction. Others had begun to internalize what they had seen, not consciously, not as a decision, but as a shift in how they understood their own actions. One evening, as the sun lowered and the air cooled, a small group gathered near the edge of the field. Not openly, not in a way that would draw attention. Just a few people standing closer than usual, speaking more quietly than normal. Hagar was not among them. She did not need to be. The conversation was not about her directly, but it was because of her. Why do we do it this way? One asked. Because we are told to, another replied. That is not an answer, the first said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something that had not existed before. The recognition that a question could exist without immediate dismissal. That thought could exist without immediate punishment. That there was space, however small, to consider something different. These moments multiplied, quietly, without structure, without leadership, and that made them harder to stop. The overseers could not punish a question that had not been spoken loudly. They could not control a thought that had not yet become action. They could only watch as something began to grow beneath the surface of what they believed they controlled. The master saw it more clearly than anyone else. He understood systems, understood how they function, how they maintained themselves, how they responded to pressure. And what he saw now was not external pressure. It was internal change. The kind that cannot be forced out because it is not imposed from outside. It grows from within. He approached Hagar again, not with authority, not with expectation, but with something closer to acknowledgement. "You knew this would happen," he said. Hagar looked at him. "No," she replied. "Then how did it begin?" he asked. She answered simply. It was already there. The answer stayed with him longer than any explanation would have, because it revealed something deeper than cause and effect. It revealed that what he believed he controlled had always contained the possibility of change. It had just never been seen clearly enough to emerge. The structure of the plantation did not collapse, not yet, but it was no longer stable in the way it had been. Orders were still given, work was still done, but the space between command and action had changed. There was thought where there had once been immediate response. There was awareness where there had once been repetition. And that space, however small, was enough to alter everything. The overseers grew more aggressive in small ways, attempting to reassert control where they felt it slipping. Their voices grew sharper, their expectations more rigid, but their efforts revealed something they did not intend. The more they tried to force certainty, the more visible the uncertainty became. Because control that must constantly reinforce itself is already weakening. Hagar remained steady within it all. She did not escalate, did not push, did not take advantage of the changes in ways that would draw direct retaliation. She understood something the others did not fully see yet. Change, when forced too quickly, is met with force. But change that grows quietly becomes something harder to confront. The master stood one morning looking across the field, watching as the work continued, but not in the same way it always had. There was something different in the movement. Not slower, not disobedient, but aware. And in that awareness, he saw the future of what he had built. Not immediate collapse, but inevitable change. He turned to Hagar, who stood not far from him, her posture unchanged, her presence as steady as it had always been. "What happens next?" he asked. Hagar did not look away from the field. "It continues," she said. The simplicity of the answer unsettled him more than anything else, because it meant there was no single moment to stop. No single action to take, no single solution to apply. It meant the system would have to face something it had never been designed to handle. Not rebellion, not defiance, but thought. And thought, once awakened, does not return to sleep. Part 5 will continue as the tension reaches a breaking point, and the system is forced to respond to something it can no longer contain. Part 5. Chapter 5. Tension does not always explode. Sometimes it stretches, tightening slowly until everything within it begins to strain. That was what the plantation had become. Not chaotic, not broken, but strained. Every movement carried a weight that had not been there before. Every command held a pause before it was followed. Every interaction felt slightly off balance, as if something invisible had shifted the ground beneath it. The overseers felt it most. They could not name it, could not isolate it, but they knew something was wrong. Control no longer flowed the way it once had. It had to be reinforced, repeated, watched more closely. And the more they tried to force it back into place, the more obvious its instability became. The first real fracture came from something small. It always does. A simple instruction, given without thought, repeated the same way it had been for years. A man was told to carry a load across the field in the usual way, even though the ground had shifted from recent rain. He paused, just briefly. Then he adjusted his path, choosing a route that made more sense. The overseers saw it immediately. Not the adjustment itself, but the decision behind it. That pause, that choice, that moment where obedience had been replaced by thought. He reacted quickly, his voice sharp, his authority pushing back against something he could not allow to grow. "You were told how to do it," he said. The man did not argue. He did not resist. But he did not apologize either. "This way works better," he replied. The silence that followed was not defiance. It was recognition. Others had seen it. Others had understood it. And that made it dangerous. The punishment came, but it felt different this time. Not because it was less severe, but because it did not erase what had already happened. The choice had been made. The thought had existed. And once something exists, it cannot be undone simply by force. The overseers began to tighten their control after that. More observation, less tolerance, faster reaction to anything that resembled independent thinking. But their actions revealed something they did not intend. They were no longer maintaining control. They were chasing it. The master saw this clearly. He had built his life on understanding systems, on knowing how to maintain order without constant disruption. But what he was seeing now was not disorder. It was transformation. And transformation does not respond to the same methods as rebellion. You cannot punish a shift in thinking the same way you punish an action. Because the action may stop, the thought does not. He walked the fields more often now, not to enforce, but to observe. To understand what was happening before it reached a point he could not manage. But each time he looked, the pattern became clearer. It was not one person, not one moment. It was many small changes, each one barely noticeable on its own, but together forming something that could not be ignored. And at the center of it all, without ever placing herself there, was Hagar Ashford. Chapter 6. The breaking point did not come from violence. It came from refusal. Not loud refusal, not open defiance, but something quieter and far more difficult to control. A group was given an order late in the day. Unnecessary work meant only to reinforce authority rather than accomplish anything meaningful. In the past, it would have been followed without hesitation, not because it made sense, but because it did not need to. This time, something different happened. They looked at each other, not for permission, not for direction, but for understanding. And in that shared moment, something passed between them, not spoken, but clear. One of them stepped forward. "We will finish the work that matters," he said. The overseer stared at him. The words were simple, but they carried something that had never been allowed to exist. Choice. "You do not decide what matters," the overseer replied, his voice tightening. The man did not raise his voice, did not step back. "It already does," he said. The tension in the air became something solid, something that could almost be touched. Others stood still, not moving forward, not retreating, but present in a way that made the moment impossible to isolate. This was not one person refusing. It was something shared. The overseer moved quickly, stepping forward, his authority shifting into force. But something stopped him, not physically, not by action, by realization. If he acted now, it would not end with one person. It would spread, because the moment had already changed. He lowered his hands slowly, and in that hesitation, everything shifted. The master watched from a distance and understood. This was the moment, not a rebellion, not a collapse, but a line that had been crossed. The system had reached its limit. It could not force what no longer responded to force. It could not control what no longer depended on control. He turned away slowly, his mind no longer searching for solutions, but accepting something he had never considered before. This could not continue as it had. And for the first time, the question was not how to maintain control, but what would happen if he stopped trying. Hagar stood at the edge of the field, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged. She had not led this moment. She had not spoken for it, but it had happened. Because of what she represented, and because of what others had begun to understand. The system was not being attacked. It was being outgrown. The moment the overseer lowered his hand, something irreversible settled across the plantation. It was not loud, not visible in the way people expected change to appear, but it was final. The line had been crossed, not through violence, not through rebellion, but through understanding. And once understanding reaches that point, it does not retreat. The overseers felt it immediately. The same men who once moved with unquestioned authority now found themselves measuring their actions, calculating responses instead of reacting instinctively, because something had shifted in the balance, and they could feel it even if they could not explain it. The workers returned to their tasks, but not in the same way. The rhythm was still there, the structure still present, but the certainty was gone. There were pauses where there had once been immediate movement. There were glances exchanged where there had once been isolation. There was awareness where there had once been repetition. And that awareness did not disrupt the work, it changed the meaning behind it. The system still functioned, but it no longer held absolute control over how it was experienced. And that difference, though subtle, was everything. The master did not sleep that night. He walked through the house, the same space that had once represented stability and authority now feeling different beneath his feet. Not because it had physically changed, but because his understanding of it had. He could see the system clearly now, not as something permanent, but as something maintained. And anything that must be maintained can be altered. That realization stayed with him as he moved from room to room, the silence pressing against him in a way that demanded acknowledgement. By morning, the decision had already begun forming, not as a sudden conclusion, but as something that had been building quietly beneath everything he had witnessed. He stepped outside, looking across the land that had once felt entirely his. And for the first time, he did not see ownership. He saw people, individuals, minds, and within that recognition, something changed in him that could not be reversed. Chapter 7. He called them together, not with urgency, not with force, but with intention. The workers gathered slowly, their movements steady, their expressions carrying the same awareness that had been growing within them. There was no confusion in their presence, no fear in the way they stood, only attention. And that attention felt different from anything the master had experienced before. He stood before them, not elevated, not distant, but present. The words he was about to speak did not come easily, not because he did not know them, but because of what they represented. They were not just a change in instruction, they were a change in everything. "This ends here," he said. The words moved through the group, not loudly but deeply. No one reacted immediately, because they understood that this was not something to respond to quickly. It was something to absorb. "You are no longer bound to this place," he continued. Silence followed, but it was not empty. It was full of recognition, of realization, of something that had been building long before this moment and had now reached its natural conclusion. One of them stepped forward slightly. "What does that mean?" he asked. The master met his gaze. "It means you decide what comes next." The simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it did not just offer freedom, it acknowledged something that had already begun to exist. Choice. And choice, once recognized, cannot be taken back. The moment held for several seconds, then slowly movement began. Not rushed, not chaotic. People turned, looked at one another, then began to walk. Not away in panic, not in confusion, but with purpose. Some moved toward the road, others toward the edges of the land. Each step deliberate, each decision their own. The plantation did not empty all at once. It changed. The structure that had once defined it began to dissolve, not through destruction, but through absence. And in that absence, the land itself seemed to shift, as if it had been waiting for this moment to arrive. The master remained where he stood, watching as everything he had known transformed in front of him. Not with regret alone, but with understanding. Because what had happened was not forced upon him. It had been revealed to him. And that difference mattered. Hagar stood at a distance, her posture unchanged, her presence as steady as it had always been. She did not move with the others immediately. She watched, not to guide, not to direct, but to witness, because this moment did not belong to her alone. It belonged to everyone who had reached the same understanding. The master turned toward her one last time. "You changed this place," he said. Hagar shook her head slightly. "No," she replied. "You finally saw it." The words settled between them, not as accusation, but as truth. And truth, once seen, does not disappear. The land did not forget, but it changed. Without the weight of forced labor pressing into it day after day, the fields began to lose their rigid lines. Crops that had once grown in perfect rows slowly gave way to uneven patterns, then to wild growth, then to something that resembled what the land might have been before it was shaped by control. The main house stood for a while longer, its structure still strong, its walls still holding the echo of everything that had taken place inside it. But without purpose, even the strongest structures began to weaken. Windows remained open. Doors stayed unused. Silence settled into every room, not the silence of fear, but the silence of absence. The people who had left did not all go in the same direction. Some moved toward places they had only heard about, guided by possibility rather than certainty. Others stayed nearby, not out of attachment to what the plantation had been, but because it was the only land they had known. But wherever they went, something remained with them. Not instruction, not command, but understanding. The recognition that thought itself was something that could not be taken once it had been realized. That awareness moved quietly, carried in conversations, in decisions, in the way they approached a world that had once told them they had no say in it. Hagar Ashford did not follow a path that could be easily traced. For a time she remained near the land, not as someone bound to it, but as someone who understood what had happened there. She walked the fields as they began to change, her steps steady, her presence as calm as it had always been. There was no need for her to stay, and yet she did for a while. Not because she belonged to the place, but because the place had revealed something that could not be ignored. And when she finally left, it was not with announcement, not with farewell, but with the same quiet certainty that had defined everything she had done. Her story did not end with her departure. It spread, not as legend, not as exaggeration, but as something real that people had witnessed. A woman who had been sold 12 times because she could not be controlled. A mind that refused to bend even when everything around it was designed to force it into submission. A presence that did not shout, did not lead openly, but changed everything simply by existing in a way that could not be reshaped. Those who heard about her did not always believe every detail. Some dismissed parts of it, reduced it to something they could understand more easily. But even in those retellings, something remained. The central truth, that there are limits to control. That intelligence, when paired with clarity, cannot be owned in the same way as the body. That systems built on obedience begin to weaken the moment thought is introduced into them. The master did not leave the land. Not immediately. He remained in the house for some time, not to rebuild what had been, but to sit with what he had come to understand. The silence that filled the space was no longer oppressive. It was reflective. Each day that passed stripped away another layer of what he had once believed, leaving behind something simpler. Not innocence, that could not be returned, but awareness, the same awareness he had resisted for so long. When he finally left, he did so without reclaiming anything. He walked away from the house, from the fields, from the system that had defined him, carrying nothing with him but the understanding he had gained too late to undo the past, but just in time to ensure it would not continue in the same way. Years passed. The plantation disappeared. Not in a single moment, but gradually as nature reclaimed what had been forced into order. The house collapsed, the paths faded, the land returned to something that no longer held the same shape. But the story did not disappear with it. Hagar Ashford remained in memory. Not as a figure of rebellion, not as a symbol of destruction, but as something far more powerful. A reminder that a human mind, once fully aware of itself, cannot be reshaped by force alone. That quiet resistance can be stronger than loud defiance. That change does not always begin with action. Sometimes it begins with thought.